couple of days. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, without further ado, it's a huge honor to welcome Mr. Fonteh Akum, the executive director of a major think tank, Institute of Security Studies. It's a pleasure to welcome you. Hello again. First of all, just to introduce this debate, our aim today is to discuss the sort of changing relationship between African nations and Europe. What multipolarity has to do with the African agency, and what steps can and should be taken in some noteworthy areas to improve the collaboration and form some new partnerships. As we know, the African continent is enormous, with so much diversity, so many nations included, and a huge growing population. And until today, and we still battle with in Europe with this unknown aspect. Came across during the United Nations vote, and also what we as European Debate Initiative want to clarify and highlight, that we've been also not aware of what's going on, and it has been also a big emergency for us to or ring a bell that this is something that we have to all take into account, and we have to care more. And I think today's debate is really to show and see what we have been missing, and get some answers to our questions. So, Mr. Akum, I would like to give you the floor, because I still think that it would be valuable for you to speak and tell us about yourself. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Hi, Ivan. Thanks to the European Debate Initiative for the opportunity to actually come here today to have more of a conversation than a debate about Africa in its diversity within a changing global context. I'm Fonteh Akum, as you very well mentioned. I'm the executive director of the Institute for Security Studies. And I think often it's worth stating the position from which I speak. First off, the Institute for Security Studies is an applied policy research organization based with headquarters in South Africa, but with offices across the continent, in Dakar, in Bamako, in Nairobi, and Addis Ababa. So we actually claim to a Pan-African agenda. And the purpose of the organization is actually to advance human security and human development on the continent. That said, we're sitting within a specific context globally at the moment where we need to underline two things. First of all, is the geographical entity of which we speak today. And even it's great that you actually spoke to Africa's diversity, but that could be refracted through a number of prisms. The first is the 54 African countries that make up this diverse continent, including the diversity within each country itself. The second dimension, I think, what's being on the table is the fact that Africa has 7 interesting regional economic communities with very varying capabilities as well, right? And of course, there's the role of the African Union as the continental body that tries to make sense of all of this diversity and actually advance its agenda, which at the moment is articulated through Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. The second construct that I think is at the center of our conversation today is the assumption we make of the nature of the world in which we are living. The argument is often made that we are living in a multipolar context. What is multipolarity today? What does it mean, and for whom? And who is defining this multipolarity? There are 2 things to take into consideration. The first is the different factors that are driving a world which, in fact, is in transition more than either unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar, right? Because we are not too sure as to where the world would end up once this reconfiguration ends. And three factors are driving what we are seeing happen. The first is the rise of cross-cutting transcendental challenges. When you look at the pandemic, which is just ebbing, it's an issue which affects the whole globe, right? And we have to think of collective solutions to pandemics. The second is the climate challenge, which is a transcendental issue as well, which is affecting different continents and different countries as well, but necessitating collective solutions. The third is the nature and form of conflicts globally, right, which has implications for all of us, whether it's about human movement or the use of force as a means to articulate foreign policy. So these are all dimensions which are driving the necessity for a more responsive, effective, and transformative and sustainable global governance architecture. And I think that provides sort of the framing for our conversation today. And I hope that from that, at least, we have a number of questions which would emerge. Thank you, Ivan. Over back to you.
Thank you very much. I think you already, I'm John, I'm one of the moderators of this. I think you touched on plenty of very, very interesting points that we would like to discuss today. I just want to highlight that we highly encourage you to post your questions into the chat, dear audience. We want to give you the floor when the flow of the discussion kind of allows for it. And just to maybe kick off the discussion on the conversation on one point that you mentioned, like the multipolarity, also as well as the diversity of African nations and their own agency in a way. We advertised the event a little bit around this UN votes that happened essentially. And for people that maybe don't know, essentially there was a UN vote following the Russian invasion of Ukraine that was supposed to condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And I think roughly 26 of the 54 African states declined to support it. That doesn't mean they endorsed it, but they didn't explicitly condemn it, essentially, which for many diplomats in the Western Europe, in the Western world, in the European circles, kind of came as a big shock, especially given Africa's long-hold principles of territorial integrity, given the fact that especially also us Europeans have a long history of territorial violations on the African continent. So one would kind of expect that there would be a lot of, respect for nations' borders in that sense. So it kind of became as a bit as a surprise, I would guess. The question here being, could you maybe walk us through what has led up to part of this moment? Why do African states chose to not condemn Russia in that sense? I'm sure there's plenty of reasons for it, but maybe you can walk us through some of them.
So first off, the premise around the votes, a series of votes have taken place beyond the General Assembly on resolutions or positions about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's a first. The second is while there has been a sort of a split in the way in which African countries have voted, there equally has been very vocal expressions from Africa taking one position, which is against this new form that undermines state sovereignty. Other than that, there's been very limited votes against the resolution, and there have been more abstentions on this vote than anything else. I cannot speak for African countries, right? We are a research organization, so we try to make sense of these trends. The first is we are entering a space within which Europe increasingly is speaking about strategic autonomy, right? And we are still trying to make sense of what strategic autonomy is. But if you look at where most African countries sit, for the past 20 years, a lot of African countries have advocated a certain degree of partnership diversification, which is slightly similar to where Europe is going with strategic autonomy. What does that mean in practical terms? It means in practical terms that since 2020, for example, African countries have engaged China within the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It means that predating that, African countries engaged with France through France-Africa engagements, with Europe through EU, Africa and EU engagements, with Turkey, Russia, and India, right? So progressively, Africa has opted for partnership diversification. African countries have opted for partnership diversification in a way that also pursues different trajectories of its interest on discussions around global financial institutions and lending. There have been a lot of engagement with the US and Europe. Of course, the Paris Club is important for this, and the London Club as well. On questions of infrastructure, and not just, it's engaged with China quite a bit ever since the advent of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. On issues of one-stop border post, for example, we have engaged with, Africa has engaged with Japan within the framework of the TCAD. So in fact, this kind of engagement has been driven by, to a large extent, the necessity for African countries to actually define their own agendas and to pursue their agendas, not just as singular entities, but also within the framework of regional economic communities, but in collaboration as well with the African Union, which has served sort of as a coordination mechanism for a lot of these engagements. Now, if you understand that diversification of partnerships, then you start making sense of where some countries' interests lie and their voting patterns when it comes to Ukraine. The second issue is actually the expectation that comes out of a certain reading of unanimity on this issue. And in a lot of spaces, there is debate about the legitimacy around NATO expansion as a trigger to the crisis. And I think that's a legitimate conversation to be had, right? The second is, what do prosperity spheres actually mean in 2023? And so if you take the totality of where we are globally, within a context where we've also seen reversals in the multilateral order actually coming from some of the leading proponents of multilateralism, right? I mean, you need to go back to the United States of Donald Trump, for example. Then there needs to be a certain degree of, first of all, respect for where African countries are voting and how they are voting. And secondly, a certain degree of quest to understand why they are voting the way they are voting, despite the reassurances that they might have given to their different diplomatic partners about where they would eventually vote. And third, we need to look at the foreign policy decision-making structures within African countries and how they actually get to decisions around voting on these issues. All those are primordial, but again, we spoke of Africa's diversity, and that diversity is crucial in understanding exactly where different countries stood on the votes.
Yeah, I think you make plenty of good points, especially also like how essentially like foreign policy decisions in each African country come to be, what the underlying factors of those are. One thing that you mentioned as well was the different types of engagements of multilateralism that African nations have been seeking out. One thing that also really connects to like this notion of multipolarity has been very high engagement by China, for instance, in African nations. Via, I think it's Belt and Road Initiative, which at least like from a European lens has been like quite demonized, called like a debt trap. And I think you wrote something about how that sometimes has been a bit misrepresented. And I think we're just curious to hear like what are some of the outcomes of like these engagements towards alternative partners such as China, Turkey as well, that have been, especially like in India, like that have been like economically like active. Like have they been overall positive? Like what are some of the, is it true that like it's the Belt and Road Initiative like represents such a debt trap, or do African states maybe have like a different perspective on that?
I really am not a custodian of the perspective of African states, right? But you've got to look at the question of the debt trap and take a step back and look at international financial system. Africa's debt trap stems from the way credit rating agencies rate the continent, therefore limiting its access to global financing in many ways, right? So it's extremely easy and convenient to look at partnerships which have been established over the last 15 years and argue that they actually are putting Africa in a debt trap without looking at it in its historical trajectory in terms of why is Africa where it is today, why are African countries where they are today in terms of debt and indebtedness, and who are they indebted to? So it's worth looking at it, because a fundamental discussion point around global governance at the moment turns on the issue of the restructuring of the international financial system. It's going to be extremely difficult for African countries to develop without access to credit on different terms than they have access to at the moment, whether from China or the BRICS initiative or from the Bretton Woods institutions. The second is the different options available to remodel the existing debt arrangements, debt modalities under which African countries are functioning. The third is basically the different priorities that are driving the African countries at the moment. One priority identified has been the issue of trade, and with the operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, trade becomes a centerpiece for Africa's future development. However, that trade is only as important as the industrial basis on the continent to actually transform primary commodities. And so that's another issue that needs to be looked at. The second thing is the necessity, and connected to that is the issue of industrialization. Can Africa actually effectively move up the development ladder without necessarily industrializing? And how does Africa industrialize without accessing financing to support that industrialization? These are fundamental questions, and that are preoccupations as well. Related to those issues, you've got to look at the question of demographics. Sitting at approximately 1.5 billion inhabitants at the moment, Africa would rise to approximately 2.1 billion inhabitants by 2050. And our projections from our African Futures and Innovations team states that Africa would actually not hit its demographic dividend, which is the number of productive workers in relation to dependent populations, until the turn of the century. That is on its own. So issues of unemployment and productivity are fundamental to addressing Africa's developmental outcomes beyond the singular narrative of China and the debt trap. So I think we need to take a step back and look at issues a lot more broadly and the way in which they get imbricated to be able to move towards policy agendas that respond to Africa's current challenges.
Yes, thank you very much. I think, yeah, you make great points. To reiterate, you mentioned that basically like in the key three priorities that you line out are that trade, industrialization, and demographics. And I think that all three of these parts are very, very relevant to also possibly European interactions, partnerships, that kind of where partnerships and essentially can be formed. For instance, I really like your point about the financial institutions and the basically existing system that we have in place, and how that relates to the Chinese debt trap that we'd like to essentially highlight, which might be a little bit what's the word? Not hubris. I don't know. Basically, a false guys. Sorry.
Short-sighted, maybe.
Short-sighted, maybe as well. Yes, exactly. But one point that I really wanted to pick up on was like that industrialization that you made about industrialization in Africa, and basically like that finance and accessing like the finance that is necessary for building a certain infrastructure in Africa is essentially key for a more sustainable, or like for African nations to tap into the future potential. And I was wondering, like, how can what type of trade deals are maybe African nations like looking for? What type of partnerships are they looking for? Particularly also from like not just from European, but like on a global level, that kind of like helps them accomplish these goals of basically better financialization, better industrialization, the use of the own resources that Africa is rich of, in order to build like core and important technologies. Like what are African nations essentially like looking for in order to tackle these issues?
Again, it's two issues need to take center stage here. First off, it's looking at the degree of inter-African trade at the moment versus Africa's trade with the rest of the world. Africa's trade is largely extroverted, and rather than internal to the continent. The second is what are some of the barriers to trade that exist at the moment? It's difficult to look at the barriers of trade without looking at the distortions that are created by subsidies in other parts of the world as well, right? And the third issue of relevance to trade is the issue of what are the energy endowments that would drive intensive industrialization on the continent, and how does Africa with its partners actually meet the energy demands for the kind of industrialization needed to drive African development. I think these three factors, again, are interconnected, and they are crucial to the ways in which, one, Africa actually develops local industry, or African countries develop local industry. Second, ways in which they transform local materials and rise up the value chain, supply chain. And the third, how they actually effectively connect to existing supply chains as well at a higher value proposition. So I think those are the fundamentals. But again, we could look at this from a very theoretical perspective and say those issues are potentially transformative, but they don't really become transformative until you test them out. And of course, there would be reversals. Of course, there are certain spaces on the continent where borders are still challenged by cross-border insecurity of different forms. But it's possible and it's necessary to actually move forward with the operationalization of the AFCFTA and build the industrial base that needs to support those processes. Of course, Africa is not a completely industrial void, right? Because if you look to spaces like South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria as well, there's already an industrial basis in place. But how do you actually spread that out across the rest of the 54 countries would be key.
Yeah, I think that makes, again, it's a fundamental piece of the puzzle to help us understand the dynamic. And I think, as well as you mentioned in the beginning, there are sort of 7 larger spheres. And also just now you said, you've talked about Egypt, specific countries which hold some sort of economic power, a very significant one within the region. So I maybe wanted to ask you to take this step further and sort of specify those significant powers and movements within the continent. I know it's, again, very difficult to have all those topics or all those spaces come up in such a short time, but I thought it would be useful for us to have at least a certain sense of the dynamic within the continent, also in this economical sense. And yeah.
So 2 things before I get to that. I acknowledge the made by Lidet in the chat, pointing us to Deborah Brautingham's publications on Chinese loans for Africa. Very welcome comment. I'm sure we would be able to talk about the expectations of the International Conference on New Global Financing Pact, which is already also one of the comments. And of course, we would be able to touch on the question of Wagner in Africa. So I would take a tangent to look at the issues of development and industrialization on the continent, while also bringing in another variable, which is the question of governance or democratic governance, right? There's an argument that the continent has seen a reversal in democratization over the past 3 years and against the backdrop of COVID-19. However, it's worth interrogating an issue which is at the core of many of the conversations today, which is, what are some of the developmental dividend that we have seen from countries which have been grappling with democratization over the past 3 decades, right? And if those countries, some of those countries have basically stuttered through the process, if some of those countries have basically contended with growing inequalities as well, growing unemployment, then what's the value of democratic governance, right? And that brings me to some of the spaces within which we have seen some rapid industrialization. Here you'd need to look at Ethiopia, for example, as a country which has seen rapid industrialization over the past 2 to 3 decades. Egypt as well has seen growth in industrialization. South Africa has seen quite a lot of investment as an export platform as well. And South Africa also serves as an industrial base for exports to the rest of the continent, with South African corporations actually servicing several tech and automotive sectors as well. And we cannot forget the importance of Africa as an energy supplier, right, globally. So these are all important, and they've got to be taken within the context within which they occur. At the moment, there is the need for regional economic communities to start with, to serve as building blocks for the operationalization of the AFCFTA, because different regional economic communities have different patterns of the free movement of individuals, capital, goods, and services across their borders. And those experimentations with these kinds of trade over the past 2 to 3 decades provides test cases for how, on a continental level, we could actually create an industrial base, which is not just based on hard industry, but also the service sector, because we have to find ways in which the service sector could also move across the continent and create mutual benefits. The second issue to put on the table there would be the necessity to look at the ways in which this development dividends do not necessarily exacerbate inequalities as well, right? Because at some point, industrialization and has to create enough of an employment basis to tackle unemployment and also bridge gaps of inequality and create a robust middle class, which you need to sustain a lot of development outcomes and to serve also as a tax basis for most countries. That is crucial. And we need to see how to make that happen. And that would also largely depend on how you bridge current processes of urbanization with the reducing ruralization that we are seeing on the continent. And finally, a key point that we'd like to note as part of these conversations generally is the fact that Africa has not yet reached its agricultural revolution. And if Africa does industrialize its agriculture to make it more productive, then it could start moving towards addressing food insecurities, not just on the continent, but also serving as an agricultural export platform, for other parts of the globe as well. So those are some of the advantages that would accrue to industrialization on the continent across different spaces. Thanks.
Could you clarify a little bit what you mean by that Africa hasn't met its agricultural revolution yet? In what way, like, is that represented or manifest itself?
So a majority of agriculture on the continent is still fairly subsistent in nature, right? Because you actually need the requisite infrastructure, first of all, to move goods from farm to market effectively before they become, particularly for perishable goods generally. The second is the need for internal transformative capacity to actually transform some products and to preserve them for not just use in these countries, but also for export, not just in regions, but across the world. So, I mean, those are the two key factors that need to change for Africa to start moving towards an agricultural revolution, which is one, effective industrialization of the agricultural sector, and two, deepening of the transformative capacity in the area of agriculture as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that clarification. You mentioned a lot of very, very good points, and also trying to maybe combine that with some of the questions that we see here in the chat. You mentioned the trifecta of democratization, industrialization. Also, you mentioned earlier like the issue of security, especially when it comes to like cross-border security. With essentially the Arab Spring, also parts of Africa having like subsided, and recently in Tunisia seeing how the equation of democracy doesn't necessarily work out just because there was a democracy. What are some of like I mean, again, like it's a huge continent, and you don't speak for all African nations, but like how do some of these considerations of industrialization maybe trump some of the considerations of democratization, and how does the aspect of security and the desire for security play a role in that, and that which we see some countries then also resort to forces in order to maybe solve that aspect in order to provide for more stable national environments or regional environments?
That's a very complex question.
I know. We can.
It covers a number of interconnected issues. Starting with connections between industrialization and, say, democratization or not. It's extremely difficult, right? Oh, let me take a step back. You've got to look at the different factors, right, that come into industrialization. One, what are the governmental policies that drive industrialization? Second, what is the degree or the level of the private sector engagement in the business sector? Third, how amenable is a specific space for business? How long does it take for an individual or group of individuals to actually start a productive business within certain countries? For all of those issues that I listed, the answer would be varied depending on what country you find yourself on the continent. However, there are certain spaces within which there have been attempts to take opportunity, say, or provide opportunity to the private sector as partners in the development agenda. And that comes with its own challenges, right? Because you've got to look at, and it's not just nationally based companies, but there's also a degree of openness to welcome foreign direct investment, which is crucial in driving the development and industrialization agenda. That's one. Second, you've got to look at the issue of governance as the society organizes itself to manage the commons, right? And it's going to be shaped by historical underpinnings, cultural factors within every context, elite bargaining, and also just some forces for the status quo, which would oppose themselves to those who want to change the status quo, and which invariably create dominant political parties and opposition parties and so on and so forth. And in that sense, you could describe some spaces on the continent as going through governance transitions. Where you've seen coups on the continent, the contestation has largely been around third-term mandates, political mandates, or the ineffectiveness of previous transitions to democracy. So what you'd find, in fact, is that political transitions are highly unstable in general. And those transitions are going to have reversals back and forth. So we'd need to look at the potential for those reversals to actually have an impact on economic and developmental outcomes. That's a second point. The third point, I think, worth putting on the table is the fact that you've got to look at the different ways in which politics manifests itself in urban spaces as well as in rural spaces. Data points to the fact that there is often there are different forms of social contestation within urban spaces as opposed to rural spaces. Within urban spaces, you largely see, you've largely seen, against the backdrop of COVID-19, a rise in social protest, right? And those social protests have either led to opposition parties winning elections in urban spaces, or coalition governments emerging, or other forms of political configurations to be able to deal with, to suck up that political pressure. But if you turn towards, say, the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, you find spaces where the government's authority has been largely contested. You find pockets of violent extremism accompanied by farmer-herder conflicts in these spaces. So it's a very checkered picture of insecurity across these different spaces. And the management of that insecurity, of those forms of insecurity, is crucial for development outcomes on the continent as well. One, there's the necessity for better preventive action or prevention, or I'd say preventive capacities to capture exactly what prevention is. Second, there's the need for anticipatory action to actually act on those early warning signs. And third, where violence already exists, there is the need to tailor responses to the problem so that those responses are more effective. And so for the multifaceted problem that you posed, that's a very difficult problem that many public sector officials have to deal with, or public administrators have to deal with. They've got to be able to find ways in which to interconnect the different dominoes that are part of the solution.
Yeah, thank you so much. I apologize for also dumping this question on you, but it's something that is, I think, very much on many people's minds. Looking at many of the dynamics we see on the African continent, and yeah, thank you so much for such an insightful answer. We want to turn to some audience questions, and Zoe, we would like to give you the floor to ask a question.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all your interesting points. I was wondering about this Global Financing Summit in Paris taking place on the 22nd of June. And as you know, it's been a long way in preparation, and there's these different working groups, and they will work in different aspects on debt, on climate crisis, on financing, and so on. So it's pretty broad in the agenda. But I was wondering specifically about the part about the reform of the multilateral development banks, because that has been and you also mentioned it earlier, there's a lot of questions around this and how can they actually be reformed, and what are the different interests there. So I'm wondering, first of all, what are your maybe general expectations about the summit, and or hopes, or both, and do you think there will be any significant change in this, specifically about the reform of the development banks, and so what have you heard or are you expecting in that respect? Thanks.
So the question is actually one which should focus on what are we solving for, right? For a lot of African countries, what they would be solving for would be, one, a credit rating system which actually de-risks investment on the continent. Yeah, because there is a disproportionate amount of risk that's associated with investing in Africa generally, which basically makes the interest rates on accessing loans to invest in Africa disproportionate as well, even for African countries. That's one. The second thing that we would need to be solving for, beyond just access to financing, is access to technology, right? And here, debates about patents within the WTO are crucial to the conversation. And if you just need to rewind a couple of years to the COVID vaccine, and discussions between European leaders and African leaders about not just restrictive measures for traveling, but ways in which you actually access the patents to the COVID vaccines. At the center of this, of course, are the private sector holders of African debt and the private entities which control the patents. And so there has to be a conversation around these issues. And the third is, I doubt that African countries are expecting handouts, but they're expecting a global system, including the international financial institutions, which are, one, more inclusive, two, which are cognizant of transformations taking place, and the ability for actors who don't necessarily have the greatest resource endowment to also be able to contribute to global solutions. And the third issue is the issue of responsibility, because the centerpiece of all of the conversations is how the globe continues to industrialize going forward, without necessarily creating the same degree of carbon emissions that we have had during the first, second, and third industrial revolutions, right? And so I often argue that industrialization should not be perceived as a dirty word. With advancements in technology, we should be able to industrialize without necessarily polluting as much as we did before. But a number of things would have to give. The first is there would be the necessity for Africa to be provided with carbon credit or African countries which can afford, which can block off parts of their landscape and biota to receive carbon credits. The second would be to work in partnership to develop the technologies, green technologies for industrialization, absolutely crucial. And the third would be where a lot of these transformations is taking place. Brilliant initiatives already emerging on the continent. Zimbabwe deciding to transform lithium in Zimbabwe rather than exporting for transformation elsewhere. These are the low-hanging fruit. And of course, part of this is the discussion around critical raw materials, right? And the ways in which Africa actually transforms those to contribute its own share. And there needs to also be a reflection around how you balance Africa's fossil fuel endowments with the push to go green as well, and ways in which you actually provide for benefits, for them to benefit from these fossil fuels without necessarily extracting them. I think these are all negotiations which countries, private sector actors would have to get into with an open mind and with an understanding that we all share a collective responsibility for the future as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the elaborate answer. And I think we have the topic of going green and climate change, but just before I want to get into that, but before that we have still some audience questions, and we have a question from Monica, who's asking, what does Europe have to offer to African nations, and what are the areas of partnership? I think you've a little bit touched upon that, but maybe if you could comment on the ways of partnership in a more concrete way, again, from the position that you're sitting in right now.
So I'd mentioned a lot of African countries move towards partnership diversification in the past. Because if you look at Agenda 2063, it's impossible for one set of partners to provide for all that there is, including what the commitments that African countries themselves make to the operationalization of this aspirational agenda. That's a first. The second is the necessity for us collectively to draw lessons from previous partnerships. Yeah, because we cannot talk about partnerships today as if we have not had partnerships before. And I just like to, it's always fascinating, anecdotally, to hear how the perspective from which, say, Europe views Berlin and Africa views Berlin, right? Often when Europeans engage on Berlin, the focus is on 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall and what that meant for Europe and European integration. When you listen to Berlin spoken to from the African continent, it's 1884-85, which was a moment during which foreshadowed a process of colonial engagement with Africa, which led to independence of most African countries starting in 1957. These are two readings of historical spaces and moments, almost a century apart, with different outcomes for Europe and Africa. So there is a necessity for history and memory to be taken seriously in European-African engagement. And I don't think it's taken seriously enough so far, right? And what that leads to is a lot of misunderstanding between European and African officials, and a certain reading of entitlement both ways, which I think are largely due to misunderstandings. So those are some fundamentals of partnership. The third is, if we are arguing that most African countries have been independent now for over 60 years. There also has to be a degree of respect for this country's choices about what partnerships they privilege, without necessarily imposing on them to make choices which are very difficult or which enhance the hegemony of one partner at the expense of another, right? Because we went through one Cold War. I doubt that the world should be moving towards another Cold War, right? Because it'd be completely different. And the partnerships should also recognize the fact that we have seen the rise of quite a few middle powers over the past 20 years. So it's not just about the importance of Europe as a bloc, of China as a country, or the United States as a counterweight to China. It actually is an acknowledgement that Turkey is also a player on the African continent, and Africa as a continent is increasingly engaging with Turkey along certain value propositions. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that India is also a potentially important partner for the African continent, right, and African countries. And it's also a recognition of the role that certain Gulf states play on the continent, not just at the level of social responsibility, but on issues of peace and security. So that partnership has to, one, be based on history, based on memory, based on effective communication, based on people-to-people exchanges, and based on an acknowledgement that there are more players trying to engage in partnerships than just Europe and the US. Thanks.
No, thank you for the, again, very elaborate answer. We have a couple of questions still in the chat. I wanted to ask you whether it's possible to go a little bit beyond. I know you're busy, so I just want to have your green light, whether it's possible to go 10, 15 minutes beyond to ask also the questions from audience. If you're busy, then we absolutely respect that too.
No, sure. I mean, we could definitely run up to 5:10.
Okay, amazing. Then a question from Hilda here, which I think also connects well with what you were saying about the need of industrialization and that. Hilda is asking that you've mentioned the need to industrialize without necessarily polluting the environment. Might you be having an idea of whether or how the FACFTA is integrating this ASA policy in promoting of infra-African trade?
So I would not be the most informed person to tell you how the AFCFTA is integrating the idea of green industrialization into its engagement. But one thing I can say is that the AFCFTA, one, is committed, at least as far as their discourse and their actions are concerned, first of all, to facilitate exchanges, cross-border exchanges, right, and respond to the issue of differentiated currencies across border spaces. I'll use an example. If you go to some of the commercial trading posts between Nigeria and Cameroon, or Nigeria and Niger, or Nigeria and Benin, you actually have people trading in Nairas and the franc CFA. You go to East Africa, and you see the shilling, the Horn of Africa, the beer, and so on and so forth. And one thing that they have committed to is lowering the barriers of exchange and enhancing cross-border trade at the most basic level. The second thing that they have committed to is actually promoting the growth of industry on the continent as a basis for trade. And so there's a preoccupation with Africa becoming if Africa does not industrialize, Africa could likely become a dumping ground for commodities from everywhere else, and that should not be the case. And certain countries within Africa have already taken a stand in terms of vehicles that they receive as imports, limiting the age to 5 years to basically limit the degree of pollution as well as part of a trade arrangement. So these are some of the arrangements that are in place, and it would be difficult to bring up the ecological question before actually getting to the basic operationalization of the AFCFTA.
Oh, thank you for the comprehensive answer. I understand that you cannot be expert on everything, but regardless, a very valuable answer. Quickly for a question from Camila. Following up on the previous question, do you think the African countries have a specific preference between China and the EU, especially in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative and EU's counterpart Global Gateway Initiative? I would be specifically interested in the conditionalities historically attached to the EU loans, whether the EU loans have any role in pushing back recipients countries and making the BRIA more attractive.
Interesting question. You see, the fact of the matter is, I don't know that there's enough clarity on what the specifics of the global gateway are in terms of the value proposition for Africa. We know what the value proposition is within the EU-AU partnership, right? I mean, that's clear. And so it would be interesting to get a better understanding of where global gateway is in concrete terms. It looks like a good package, but what is it and to whom? We would need to get clarity on that. BRI has been in place for 8 years, for almost a decade now. And of course, it's also advanced the issue of an infrastructural platform that facilitates global supply chains. An issue which was basically terribly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic as well, and the restrictions that were put in place due to that. So at the moment, I think it's almost a question of comparing apples and oranges, given the relative novelty of the global gateway as well. So we should wait and see and look at its full operationalization to see exactly how that compares. In terms of preferences, again, in partnership diversification, right? I don't think that African countries sit and say, okay, we prefer China over Europe, or we prefer Europe over China. The question that we would ask, in fact, is following the EU president's visit to China, does Europe prefer China or the US? Yeah, we could ask the same question. And when you hear evocations of strategic autonomy and the way in which China is economically embedded in Europe, I think it's a tall order to ask Africans, do you prefer China or Europe? When in fact, Europe itself is intricately interconnected and interlocked with China. So we have to step back from sort of the Manichaean positionality or the bi-positioning of actors and move towards a more constructive engagement, which looks at what are the value propositions and the interest propositions that come with engagement with one partner or the other. Because objectively, Africa has much to gain from a partnership with its closest geographical neighbor, which is Europe, and its biggest trading partner at the moment, which is China.
Yeah. Understood. Yeah, I'm sorry. Last question, and then I will give the word to John as well. Or last question from my side here. Michel is asking about his country, so I'll just read the questions. My country, Guinea-Conakry, is still struggling to address this. The necessity for foreign direct investment in Africa is very important to create more jobs. What is your opinion about the economic diplomacy to attract more investment, and what strategy do you recommend to improve this, its effectiveness?
I think that's a tough question.
Indeed.
There's been a lot of tough questions here today. You're doing great, though.
No, I mean, economic diplomacy, let me take a step back. The first proposition I would make is, after the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war in Ukraine at the moment, we need to seriously question the use of hard power as a means to projecting influence. If we put a question mark on hard power, we actually then should start moving towards a good reading and understanding of soft and smart power. And economic diplomacy is one of those aspects of smart power which are absolutely crucial in driving agendas, particularly for countries with relatively little endowments relative to others, right? Or countries with relatively smaller hard power endowments. That said, economic diplomacy also depends on what each country has on offer. And from where a lot of African countries sit at the moment, the realistic proposition would be an economic diplomacy which is based on platforms created by regional economic communities, which function as a conglomerate of actors who can pool their economic engagement with several others. So economic diplomacy is absolutely important. I mean, sitting from South Africa, I can assure you that for a country like South Africa with its industrial base, it has an interest in developing a robust economic diplomatic engagement. However, there's nothing new to economic diplomacy as well. And often, hard power diplomacy has gone in to advance economic and capitalist agendas. So you've got to be very careful about your reading of economic diplomacy. And I doubt, at least from where most African countries sit, that, the development of economic diplomacy would be part of an advancement of hard power. I think it eventually is an advancement of smart power. You can see the value of cartelization, for example, in the 1970s, in transforming the economic outcome for the main oil-producing countries of the world at that time. And today, of course, based on that cartelization of the 1970s, Saudi Arabia is pretty much a kingmaker in the Middle East, right, to a large extent. Of course, they are ruled by a king as well. So there's the possibility around the issue of critical raw materials for Africa to develop the kind of economic diplomacy that actually builds its soft power.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that very, very sharp answer. I think we all agree that hard power should be limited as much as possible. Unfortunately, I think we currently see that some countries see some value in using hard power again. I think, yeah, let's hope that that does not become a larger trend. We have one last question, maybe very quick, by Ralph, basically asking how the dialogue from the EU towards African countries should be framed in a way that he criticizes that there often is a treacherous tone in the communication from the EU, especially if certain countries don't really follow the European standards of democracy and governments. And basically the question is, what type of tone and language should the EU use to gain a better trust, to be more respectful in its ways, to basically, yeah, fall on better ears, if that even is the issue.
Well, like I mentioned before, right, it's about a certain basis for the partnership between Africa and the EU based on lessons learned. based on an understanding of each other's positionality and where they're coming from historically, as well as memory. I would not bring the issue of the return of African artifacts that are still sitting in some European museums at the moment, which is an interesting point, right? If you want to talk about collaboration. And thirdly, I think there's been a lot of cross-cultural engagement between Africa and Europe that is not fully operationalized within the current context. Lots of European scholars have worked in African context. Lots of African administrators have been trained in the European context as well. But what better space to start advancing Europe-Africa partnerships than leveraging the very individuals who come with a deep understanding of both settings and both cultures.
Yeah, thank you so much for the quick answer. Thank you so much for taking the time today to speak to us. Thanks to the audience for so many great questions. We have we appreciate you, and we just want to highlight we have more events coming up this month. You can follow us at europeandebateinitiative.com. And any final sentences, words you want to tell us, give us on our way before we let you go?
Well, listen, I mean, I think it's a pleasure to have exchanged with you. And of course, we are open to having such conversations. And more than the ISS, there are so many more policy research organizations on the continent who would be great interlocutors in this exchange. So thanks for the opportunity. Lots of interesting questions, some of which are on our research agenda at the moment. And I hope that we can have more conversations to enhance greater understanding of European and African positioning within a changing global context. Thank you.
We hope so too. Thank you so much for your time so much. Thanks for the audience. We had a blast. Enjoy. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much again. Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Yeah, bye-bye. Have a good day.